Okay, so let's dive into the organization of the endocrine system. In particular, some of the anatomy, but the physiology and the different actions that occur within our endocrine system. So, taking a look here, we can see males and females are generally alike. The only difference would be having testes as endocrine glands for males and ovaries for in females. Um, and we'll go through each of these again in different details when we relate it to exercise. That being said, it is still going to be important to have a good idea of what most of these glands do and at least be able to identify, given a few options, saying like a multiple choice, what hormones are associated with each gland. Okay. And so just to give you a little bit more of an overview here. So the pineal gland is located in the midbrain there. Hypothalamus and pituitary, we'll definitely spend some time on those. We kind of find that that it's the quote unquote master gland, and that it controls quite a few different functions through its endocrine functioning. We have our thyroid and parathyroid glands that sit right on top, kind of like little coffee beans that sit on the thyroid gland itself, which is in our throat. Some people that have a cancer of the thyroid gland, as in it develops a tumor, becomes too large, you'll typically actually be able to see changes in the throat from your surface anatomy for some individuals, and we'll learn a bit more about that. We have our thymus, located a bit more central, and our adrenal glands, which, if you can imagine a fight or flight, adrenaline, our adrenal glands, when we're thinking about exercise, very important. And they sit atop the kidneys. Our pancreas, as we, I believe, mentioned at least in our ATP or energy producing metabolism type chapters, plays a heavy role in dictating the levels of blood glucose. And last but not least, our gonadal glands for our sex hormones. Okay, so again, the testes will produce testosterone, and that's involved in a lot of anabolic kind of processes in men, amongst some other things. Ovaries produce estrogen and progesterone. Together, they have a dynamic interplay when talking about menstruation and fertility, but they also help develop, say, like secondary sex characteristics in women. Anterior pituitary, sorry, bit of a tongue twister, produces a whole bunch of hormones. So you can see why the pituitary, both the anterior and posterior components, really are kind of the master glands when it comes to the endocrine system. So growth hormone, some of you might have heard this in the context of doping. We'll cover that quite extensively in its relation to exercise. Again, mainly an anabolic or building of protein synthesis in the body. ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone, is again kind of a signal to, or a messenger to our adrenals. We'll talk about the adrenal hormones quite a bit. Thyroid stimulating hormone, that goes, of course, to our thyroid, which is kind of like a metabolism volume or a metabolism dial, if you will. FSH and LH, or follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, actually, and prolactin. So PRL here. These three are generally involved in the ovulatory cycle for women and or milk production after birth for women. Or posterior pituitary, 0 for 2 there. produces ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin. So ADH is the reason you get hangovers. That's kind of I always found that was one of the easiest ways to remember that. What it does is essentially it leads to the kidneys and to urinate more. Hence, you get dehydrated, and then you get a hangover after drinking. Or sorry, alcohol stimulates that, so that's what leads to the hangover. Our adrenal cortex and adrenal medulla, both very important, of course, for exercise. Glucocorticoids are involved in energy management, let's say, and kind of puts a pause on like amino acid production, or amino and protein production. And we have some, again, similar to ADH, but helps increase body water retention. Our adrenal medulla is really important in our fight or flight or competitive response that we briefly spoke about in the lecture just before this one. So epinephrine and norepinephrine are really important for, again, that fight or flight competitive arousal response that we get. The thyroid, as I mentioned before, it's kind of like our thermostat, so really important in regulating our just overall volume, if you will, on our metabolism throughout our body. Calcitonin has a very specific job to do with calcium, and our parathyroid hormone also comes into play there, so they actually sit quite close together. Our heart, we're not going to cover that one, but our pancreas, we definitely will, so insulin and glucagon. So again, that's a kind of scale with our glucose levels in blood. So the way I remember is insulin puts energy into the cells, and glucagon gets glucose gone out of the cell into our blood. And so again, as the two levels of those hormones change, we get different levels of blood glucose levels. Okay, and so that's the main, that's a relatively brief and quick overhaul of your endocrine system as far as the different glands. So glands that produce the hormones. Again, here's a bit more detailed version of what each of those glands do. But again, the goal is to be able to recognize what's associated with each of these glands for quizzes and your exams. Okay. So I mentioned in a prior points about the endocrine system that we have these glands, we have these hormones, and hormones are kind of like messengers. And I think building on that's important. So again, we generally, when we're talking about the endocrine system specifically, or endocrine signals, is we get these hormones that go into the blood. From the blood, it gets transported all over the body. But the hormones with receptors for that specific hormone are going to be the only ones that respond. Now, those receptors could be throughout the entire body. They could be on all our muscles, cells. They could be on just another specific endocrine organ. But regardless of what it is, it's when we're talking about endocrine signals, it's body-wide. Okay, and so in order to have any effects within the cells, you have to have some way of getting the message from the blood into those cells as some sort of a messenger system, right? So we have 3 types of hormones, and we'll explore how they actually cause effects in the receptor cells. And each of these types do it in slightly different ways. There's a couple of different ways. So steroids, they have this basis in a chemical structure from cholesterol, and kind of get changed and derived from that. And then peptides are made up of amino acids, and a version of that is amines. So what we'll find is just very similar to an amino acid, a peptide, but it'll just have a nitrogen group in there. And alas, here we are, exactly as promised. So cortisol is based off of a cholesterol type molecule, and in the classified groups of steroids. So steroids also you probably know from sport and doping would be like testosterone. Now epinephrine, that's an amine. You can tell because of this nitrogen group here in its chemical structure, and so that's going to act a little bit different relative to a steroid, but we'll talk about that a bit later. So that's epinephrine would be a very common one that you might be familiar with. And last but not least would be our peptide hormones. So peptide hormones are comprised of amino acids, which each of these three-letter kind of words represent. So like leucine, serine, there's a whole bunch of them, but they just kind of string together in different structures and create these 3D signalers or messengers. So what we'll find is we'll have a hormone release from a certain gland, and that can be triggered or caused by a mechanical, neural, or hormonal signal. So any one of those things will spur on this release of hormones. Once that's done, we'll have three types of hormones. And again, we primarily and will continue primarily to speak about endocrine. So they are directly secreted into blood and they get sent throughout the body. But some hormones are paracrine. So they're not put into the blood. They're just kind of secreted by the cell and in that surrounding area. So very localized. The signal is acted upon in that area, but it doesn't necessarily go body-wide through blood. And autocrine is when a cell will release a certain hormone and will also react to it in a positive feedback manner. So one of what I find interesting ways that our endocrine acts on us, say, in a daily manner, because a lot of the times hormones can act on us or have an effect. We'll say typically, we're talking minutes to hours. So this is different than, say, like a nervous system recruitment, which can be a matter of milliseconds to seconds, right? The stimuli is there, it's gone, it's done, right? It doesn't typically, depending on what's occurring, doesn't really last very long. But again, hormones last quite a bit longer. So we have, because of that fact, our endocrine system, our hormone system, gives us a sense of continuity, let's say even like day to day. So one of the reasons we feel like ourselves like viscerally day to day is largely due to our endocrine system. So one of those things that occur daily is our circadian rhythm. Now you might have heard of this as your sleep cycle. Now a lot of these have a regular, just generally our hormones have a regular fluctuation throughout our day, depending on what our days are like and what we typically do. But this one in particular, in regards to cortisol, has a very common and rhythm. So it's in response to light. And let's just take a look at that for a minute. I'll try to remember that point about exercise and get to it in a moment. But here we are, we're sleeping. This is midnight, we sleep. There might be some dreams, slightly different levels of deep or light sleep. And then we get to the point in time where light starts coming in our windows, and what happens is our pineal gland gets a signal because our eyes start sensing light, kicks in some cortisol levels, and then we start to wake up. And so sometime around here-ish, let's say, we actually wake up and start doing things, getting ready for our day, and cortisol very, very high here in the morning, and then it starts troughing off, get to noon, and here we are, that sweet spot, your 2 o'clock lecture, and time for a nap, right? Just super slogged, really tired. And that's pretty much the first dip in our diurnal or two dip kind of wakefulness in our day. It kind of drops around that time roughly, and then picks up again as we get close to dinner time. So 16 is 4 o'clock. So post work, just ended the day. We're getting really tired again. Get home, have some dinner, feeling pretty snoozy. We get a little kick before the end of our day when we start shutting down for bed. And of course, depending on where we live and what season it is, darkness occurs somewhere within this time frame, right? Okay, and then we do it all over again the next day. So how does that relate to exercise? And we'll try to already give you an idea how our hormonal systems tie into those things. Well, there's no finite, let's say, research to say specifically at A, B, or C times a day are the best times for training and or performance. There's been a lot of research in there, but they do have some general thoughts and ideas that they can correlate to different periods of time in the day. So for example, when our cortisol is really high, these are excellent times to partake in physical activity. One of the reasons is cortisol is typically a hormone produced during physical activity. So if we already have levels that are high in cortisol, which also occur when we're very stressed, we can actually use what it was originally designed for, this cortisol level, which was physical activity. So we kind of use a bunch of free energy and alertness and readiness, physiological readiness at that time of day. And then, interestingly, when we have a lower state of cortisol in our bodies, depending on who you are, and this is typically in elite athletes that this research has been done on, you can perform at some of your best around 2 o'clock. So after this kind of lull and cortisol levels start coming back up, just seems to be a perfect alertness for relaxed, but also aroused enough to be in a physiological state of readiness to perform at a high level. So that would be around here. When we, and that's primarily the practice and performance levels as best as research generally trends to show. But obviously everyone's days work a little bit different, and we're not all elite athletes trying to perform at world record breaking levels, which typically happens around 2 o'clock. That's all I'll say for that one. So, okay, we get these signals, we get a big dose of hormone, let's say cortisol here at this part of our day, but then what happens? Well, it does last hours, but it does go away. So it has this thing called a half-life. So a half-life for a hormone is different for each hormone, and it more or less says how long can it stay in the blood before it reaches half its peak value. So let's say you dump 100 microliters of cortisol into blood because you're an adrenal gland, and how long does it take for that 100 to reach 50 micrograms per liter? So again, that's what a half-life is. And so again, hormones get degraded and kind of recycled back into the body to be used again. Now, hormones bound to proteins or other molecules take longer because they're kind of sheltered by that joint venture. And half-life time or interacting with a receptor, the hormone degrades once we have that interaction fairly quickly. Okay. Good. So we kind of have this idea, just to recap where we're at. We have these hormones that are released through our body. That we have a couple of different types. They happen primarily, throughout the body, but can happen a bit locally as well. They degrade over time because of this half-life. And so what happens when we release them? Well, there's this idea of pulsatility, and they release hormones in smaller or larger pulses. And the idea is it should be enough to affect the receptor cell of what we're trying to target. And it can just vary. So if we look at growth hormone between young females and males, and throughout the day, this is just some aggregate data. And so the idea is we can see that there's some larger pulses that occur every once in a while, small pulses that occur once in a while, more often small with older individuals than younger, where we tend to get larger ones. But what happens? So, kind of the next step, and I think probably the most important part about the endocrine system and just any physiological or biological system that we're looking at, is once we get, say, this huge dose, there's obviously a stimuli that cause maybe a weight lifting session for this young female to cause this large pulse of growth hormone. What happens afterwards? Do we just keep going? Do we keep continuing? No, obviously there's some sort of shutdown mechanism. And so what is that? That's our negative feedback system. So we have some sort of hormone that is released to shut down whatever is happening at a certain gland. And we have positive feedback systems that will encourage the continued secretion of a certain hormone from a gland. Okay, and testosterone, there's a hormone that will act to shut that off. Oxytocin, there's hormones that will encourage it, typically in and around, different process. So it's a release when everything from when we're, say, hugging to during childbirth and we get more and more increased secretion signals in a positive feedback manner. Now, multiple feedback influences, they're a little different, but they're meant to be redundant for very vital processes. So we have a few systems like this in our body. In our nervous system, we have something called the brachial plexus, which has multiple nerves overlapping and connecting, so that if two are severed, we still have a nerve connection to our limbs, in particular our arms. But when we're talking about anabolic hormones, we have a lot of overlap for vital processes there. Okay, great. And so this is really important again when we're talking about more immediate, shorter term kind of changes, like day-to-day changes, keeping in check and keeping these pulses controlled through a feedback system, typically negative feedback. Actually, and you know what, just to clarify too, I have a couple other, sorry for the blurriness, but if we're trying to maintain homeostasis with a negative feedback loop, this is typically how it does. So to return to an idea outside of endocrine systems, so our body will be nice and neutral in a happy temperature range. If we start getting cold, a signal from that stimuli will cause us to shiver. But as our body temperature increases, we'll get that signal to stop shivering. So that will be the negative feedback. And then very similar, if we get too hot, we get a signal to sweat. But as the body temperature decreases back to a normal range, we'll have a negative feedback to stop the sweating process. So stimuli is typically what we have. Some sort of sensor, we'll have a control mechanism, and then an effector, which will send out the negative signal to shut down whatever was occurring. Okay. All right, let's press forward. So yeah, we'll have seasonal changes in hormones that occur. And again, that's affected by different things, temperature and daylight. Daylight is typically a large component of that because we have such a innate system built in with our pineal gland and our cortisol, so the circadian rhythms. But once we change our physical activities, our training or so we can strain our tax our body quite a bit, and through a lot of training, or when we detrain, the endocrine glands and endocrine levels that we're used to change as well. They reset. Occasionally, we have resultant behavioral responses to that training or detraining, which will affect our sleep and nutrition as well. Okay, so again, just a brief review. Have some hormones, quite a few. They affect our body in lots of different ways through generally a whole landscape. We have steroid and peptide-based hormones that can affect our whole body or locally, It's involved in day-to-day stuff such as our circadian rhythm. They'll degrade, and we have control of those day-to-day systems through feedback loops, which can happen largely also over seasonal or months versus just hours and days. But how, once we send out those signals and have these negative feedback systems in place, how does our body know what to do with that? Well, we have receptors, and again, specific receptors for either peptide or steroids. And the way these work are quite different. So at the end of the day, we're trying to cause some sort of signal to our DNA to transcribe something, make more proteins, or make more it'll usually be protein in some way, shape, or form, but build something, or create another hormone or something. So when we have our peptide receptor actions, for example, we have insulin here and our cell and our receptors on the outside. What will happen is we have insulin bind to these transmembrane or membrane-bound receptor and receptors. What will happen is we'll get a signal and a conformational change in the binding site in the receptor itself, which will then have secondary messengers. So these secondary messengers start a system once you have a conformational change in the receptor from the binding external to the cell. We have this internal change, which causes a internal cascading series of events, which, as you can see, you don't have to remember every step of this, by the way, but it's, for illustration, you can see a whole series of secondary messengers occur to create a whole slew of different intracellular changes from an extracellular signal that will eventually lead to taking in glucose. So we see this translocation, or essentially installation of a glucose for receptor to allow glucose into the cell. Okay, so that's a peptide receptor action, acts through secondary messengers. Whereas if we look at our steroid receptor, we have our steroid bound to protein transporter, more or less. And once that hormone becomes free, because it's lipid based, so it's cortisol or cholesterol based, it can essentially enter the cell by any part of the cell it wants. So if we remember just in brief our biology of what our cell membranes are like, cellular membranes, so they have hydrophilic on the outside, hydrophobic on the inside, and that's why we need these membranes to allow these hydrophilic the compounds into the cell, because they can't get past the hydrophobic or the water hating inside. But to do that, because they're kind of fatty, you need something fatty. So what we can do essentially with this fat-based hormone or a steroidal hormone, they just zip right through the cell membrane and get to their steroid hormone receptor bound with these heat shock proteins on the other side that become activated. So the heat shock proteins come off. Heat shock proteins are essentially there just to help that receiver keep its conformational shape and receive these this hormone, okay, the steroid-based hormone, and then essentially from there migrates its way directly to the nucleus in the DNA, where it instantly essentially causes transcription of whatever proteins that it was instructing the cell to make. So steroids essentially just like barge right in the house and start making themselves some food in the kitchen, whereas our peptide receptors are much nicer guests. They don't even necessarily enter the home. They knock on the door and will call you from afar while all the happenings is going on inside the house. Okay, all right, that concludes the organization of the endocrine system introduction.